a pleasure on our end to co-organize this series with the Wage Indicator Foundation, as we are both the Democratizing Work Network and the Wage Indicator Foundation, trying to illuminate the big challenges that workers face, inspired by the three fundamental principles of the Democratizing Work Manifesto: democratize, decommodify, and decarbonize. Together, we also hope to help put this perspective on top of the economic and political agenda through organizing the dialogue between the scientific community and practitioners worldwide, be them business or union leaders, elected officials, public servants, journalists, or members of the civil society. So this is our first workshop for the year 2024-25, and you can access all relevant information about the series via our dedicated webpage on democratizingwork.org, and also we'll connect you in the chat with the link to the next workshop. Today, we have the opportunity to discuss the historic report that was submitted by Professor Olivier de Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Olivier is an expert on human rights with a special focus on economic and social rights. Prior to this mandate, Olivier held other important positions within the United Nations. In particular, between 2008 and 2014, he was appointed Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Olivier de Schutter is also the past Secretary General of the International Federation of Human Rights and is teaching at the law schools of the University of Louvain in Belgium and Sciences Po Paris in France, among other prestigious places. The report titled Eradicating Poverty Beyond Growth, and we are going to, I can see that in the chat already, the link to the report. Thank you, Lee. The report identifies democratizing work as a key strategy in the fight against poverty, in the context of an economic regime that remains within planetary boundaries. And we know that this is a crucial target. This is the decarbonizing aspect of our Democratizing Work Manifesto. We know that decarbonizing is only one aspect of the problem. The discussion indeed is all the most urgent, as we know from current scientific estimates that global warming is certainly going to go beyond the safe threshold identified as 1.5 degree in increase in global warming temperature, and that we have recently crossed the safe space within a 7th planetary boundary out of the 9th planetary boundaries that ensure our Earth system to stay on balance. Today, after Olivier introduces the main points of his report and the role of democratizing work in it, we will hear from three distinguished panelists, whom I will briefly introduce before they speak. So just let me mention them at this stage. We will hear from Professor Nicolas Bueno, from Yolanda Fresnillo, and from Chidi King. Thank you so much for being here to continue our discussion. And Olivier, the floor is yours. You may start with sharing your slides and we'll check if everything is going right. Thank you so much, Olivier.
Great. Well, thank you, Isabel, for this very generous introduction. I really look forward to discussing the role of work in a post-growth society, and more precisely, how democratizing work can help move towards a post-growth society. As you rightly mentioned, this is based on a report I presented a couple of months ago at the Human Rights Council in my role as Special Rapporteur of the UN on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. The title of the report is Eradicating Poverty Beyond Growth. And what I would like to do in the 20 minutes or so I will be using, looking forward, of course, to the reactions of Nicolas Bueno, Yolanda Fresnillo, and Chidi King, is simply to put democratizing work into that context. A broad alliance of NGOs, think tanks, unions are now trying to think beyond growth and to move away from the fetishism of the GDP increase as a way to address societal challenges. And part of the contribution you can make as a network, I think, is to help us rethink how the world of work should be rethought in order for it to contribute to that global objective, which actually will be on the table of the discussions at UN level in various international summits that prepare the post-SDG world beyond 2030. I will try to share my slides and let's hope this is readable for you.
That's perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So as I said, the report Eradicating Poverty Beyond Growth is available. The link is in the chat box that you were that provides that link, and the report exists in the UN official languages. And the main message of the report is that we can do better in the fight against poverty by expanding the toolbox at the disposal of policymakers without having to increase the GDP as a condition for addressing poverty. And I prepared this report because I realized that although there are many arguments to stop focusing on GDP increase, the usual contradiction we have, or the usual objection that is raised when we speak about moving beyond GDP as a measure of social progress, is that, of course, continuing to increase the GDP has a number of problematic impacts, but at least it is indispensable in the fight against poverty. And that is, I think, what I wanted to challenge. And I start in the report, I have 6 messages. I start in the report by saying that we still work within the UN in particular, within UN agencies, in a very classic approach to combating poverty, in which the fight against poverty is really the result of a 3-step sequence. We first grow the economy, we then tax corporations and high-income earners, and then we redistribute wealth by financing public services, social protection. And that is the ex-post, post-market compensatory approach to combating poverty. Now, that was what was at the basis of the Fordist Compromise in the post-Second World War era. And of course, the more you redistribute, the more you support the protection of the purchasing power of low-income households and the middle class, the more you fuel the possibility of continuous economic growth. That is why this compromise was so attractive. And the basic debate in those years was how much should go to the state in public revenue, through taxes, how much should go to workers to reward them with higher wages linked to productivity gains, and how much should go to the shareholders of corporations. And I think this is now increasingly problematic. It's problematic first because it's becoming more and more difficult for states to tax high wealth individuals and corporations. It's also problematic because social protection is less and less equipped to reduce poverty because of a number of leakages in the social protection system. We unfortunately don't have time to go through this. But the basic problem is that this view of how to combat poverty results in the state being forced to strike a compromise with corporations because it is on the wealth of corporations that the ability for the state to tax and transfer depends. And so the state is forced to create an environment in which corporations can increase their wealth and basically provide mass production for mass consumption, and that is how poverty can be tackled. Now, the argument I make in the report is that that is now a defunct way of thinking about the fight against poverty. I think we have to continue to fight for the welfare state. I think we have to continue to alert governments to the need to improve their ability to tax high income earners and corporations. We need to combat this weakening of this redistributive system, but we have also to, as I said, increase the toolbox or enrich the toolbox with new approaches. In addition, it is clear from many studies that the increase of GDP per capita is not really contributing to improving well-being anymore in rich countries, especially when it is combined with growing inequalities, as increasingly people compare their situation with that of others within the same community, and they are, even if they have their basic needs covered, they experience social exclusion when they cannot compete with others, given that comparatively to others, their incomes are too low. And also because as a society grows, the social norms about how to spend and which lifestyle to espouse change, and it becomes extremely problematic in this sort of rat race to continue to compete with others. In other terms, the signpost continues being moved forward at the same time that average incomes increase in a society that gets richer on average, leaves some people behind. And so that is the departure point, and the first message is that we must go beyond that approach. The second message is that increasing the GDP not only will not serve the purpose of really combating social exclusion, it also may become counterproductive. Now, the notion of counterproductivity that I borrow from Ivan Illich is close to the notion of an uneconomic growth that was popularized by Herman Daly in the 1970s. And it is linked to various studies that in the 1970s were questioning both the feasibility and the desirability of infinite growth. The Club of Rome report, 1972, the work of Tibor Skitowski, 1974, The Joyless Economy, in which he showed that we were actually constantly on the search for new experiences, novel experiences, and we were never satisfied with what we had. We were addicted to novelty, and thus there were limits to what growth could provide, since it was a never-ending quest for more and more exciting experiences. And then the fantastic work by Fred Hirsch, unfortunately, who died prematurely, but who published in 1976, The Social Limits to Growth, in which he showed that as an economy grows, more and more goods are of a positional nature. Positional goods are goods that are useful or interesting to the person having these goods because they allow to rank yourself within society. And the more those goods are democratized, the more the access to these goods are democratized, the less interesting they are for the owner, for the consumer. For example, in the 1950s, cars, individual cars, may have been extremely desirable because they allowed you to impress the neighbors and to travel faster. Now it has become burdening, creating air pollution, traffic jams, and not allowing you to rank yourself within society, because everyone basically has relatively easy access to an individual car. So growth may at some point become uneconomic. And Herman Daly used this very simple scheme that I now am presenting, showing that as growth was pursued, the environmental impacts were rising. So this is the curve towards the right end of the graph. And at the same time, the additional consumption allowed by growth gave less and less pleasure, provided less and less improvements to well-being, so that at some point the two curves cross, and the ills of growth, the disadvantages of growth, if you wish, start outweighing the benefits, and that is when growth becomes uneconomic or counterproductive. In fact, in my most recent report to the UN, which is from October of this year, I study how we have created a burnout economy in which the pressures on workers have become such that in the richest economies, we have the highest rates of anxiety, depression, burnout, linked to this pressure imposed on workers to be competitive, to be productive, and on households who fear that they will be excluded if they don't manage to stay in this rat race that I was describing. And these two graphs here show how depression, anxiety increase in numbers as societies become richer. One of the major reasons for this is because the more a society is rich, the less people can count on social solidarity of an informal nature, based on family relationships and friends, and the more they fear social comparison. That is what results from the work of Richard Leahy that showed that the reason why people were anxious and depressed and fell into burnout in rich societies was not because they did not have access to healthcare or because they were not well taken care of when they identified mental health issues. It is because societies are becoming more and more individualistic and less forgiving to those who do not succeed. In fact, this was at the heart of the work of Angus Deaton and Anne Keyes in the book that, of course, all of you have been influenced by, I'm sure, Deaths from Despair and the Future of Capitalism, in which they show that in the US, one segment of society, the least qualified blue-collar workers, particularly white workers in the US, are increasingly affected by alcoholism, drug use, especially opioid use, and suicide, so that their life expectancy is decreasing. And this is the chart showing how that particular segment, white, non-Hispanic people with a high school degree or less, in other terms, without a college degree, have been increasingly witnessing a fall in life expectancy due to basically this anxiety they face and this sense that they're becoming redundant as a result of globalization, automation of work, and the fears they have for the future. So that was my second message in the report, that actually focusing on growing the GDP further is becoming deeply problematic. My third message, and this is one I can very quickly pass on, it's not the focus of our discussion today, is that we cannot continue to pretend that pursuing economic growth is possible without further worsening the environmental crisis. Green growth is a myth. We cannot decouple growing the GDP from environmental impacts. At the heart of ecological economics is this idea that the relationships between firms and households, in which firms provide work against wages to households, and households spend the money for the goods and services that firms produce for the markets, should be re-embedded in the ecosystems on which we depend. That process of production and consumption depends on the resources we can use, and depends on the pollution and waste that ecosystems can absorb. And basically, the idea of green growth is that we could continue to grow the center of this scheme without worsening the impacts on the environment, without further plundering the non-renewable resources of the planet, and without taxing the ability for ecosystems to absorb the pollution and waste that we produce in this process. And that is not working. The most recent study on this is from Joachim Vogel and Jason Hickel in the Lancet Planetary Health issue of July 2023, in which they ask, is green growth happening? And the answer is that in some industrialized countries, it is true that GDP has been increasing in recent years, whilst at the same time, emissions of greenhouse gases responsible for the heating of the planet have been decreasing. But that is only true for a limited number of industrialized countries whose emissions per capita are extremely high. It is not true for emerging economies and developing countries. Secondly, even though there is this decoupling of greenhouse gas emissions from GDP increases, that decoupling is far from what would be needed in order to remain within the safe planetary boundary identified in the Paris Agreement of 2015 under the UNFCCC framework. And thirdly, and most importantly, this only refers to one environmental crisis, which is the climate change crisis. But biodiversity loss, the extraction of resources, other forms of pollution of the air or of the soils or water are not taken into account. And I think there is now a consensus amongst scientists that green growth is not achievable. So that's another reason to focus beyond GDP.
Olivier,
that is also...
Yeah, your last 5 minutes, Olivier, would that be
Sure.
okay? Yeah, wonderful.
So the fourth message in the report is that the quest for GDP growth is diverting us from the real priorities. And actually, it leads policymakers to make policy choices that are proving counterproductive. It's here, Isabel, that we will discuss in greater detail the question of work. Essentially, this is what the OECD says in a report titled Beyond Growth Towards a New Economic Approach, in which they say whatever progress is expected from higher GDP can often be harmed by the ways in which it is generated, particularly for those on lower incomes and in more precarious work, and where private consumption is prioritized over the provision of public goods. Basically, what this... Oh, I'm sorry, this is a hyperlink which should not have appeared on my screen. So basically what this means is that in the name of increasing wages, of financing public services and social protection, of stimulating jobs creation, of financing environmental measures, we have been pursuing GDP growth. But to do this, we've been flexibilizing labor, facilitating trade and investment, introducing labor-saving technologies to increase work productivity. And all these policy choices are counterproductive, creating the very social exclusion that we hoped to address by GDP growth. And of course, part of this is what relates to the changes in the world of work. And so the report argues that a different approach is possible. And that different approach is based on 4 essential tools, only one of which we will discuss today. The first one is, I just cite this for the sake of comprehensiveness, combating inequalities. I could explain further, of course, why in a post-growth world, we should focus much more on combating inequalities and much less on increasing total economic output. The second lever is changing taxation, financing the services the state provides by means other than income taxes, whether corporate income taxes or personal income taxes, in order not to depend on growth to finance the provision of public services. The third tool is addressing consumption, and particularly overconsumption stimulated by the advertising industry. And the fourth is work. And here I make in the report three major proposals. First, enhance, grow the role of social and solidarity economy in which profit for shareholders is not the main objective. Secondly, to democratize the workplace to ensure that workers have a say in influencing the strategic decisions of corporations as to what to produce and how to share the profits made by the corporation. And the third is to ensure that work that is socially useful rather than toxic is better valued. And I am struck, although I discussed this in an earlier report on the working poor, I'm struck by how less value is given to work, for example, in education, healthcare, food sectors, all these essential jobs that contribute to a large part to the care economy, when so much more is provided in terms of wages to employees in the advertising industry, the financial sector, for example, that are actually toxic. So the reason why these proposals are important is because today work is largely organized on the premise that the work that should be valued is the one that creates wealth for the shareholders, and in which corporations are chiefly driven by the need to reward investors for the investment they made as shareholders of companies. And the priorities corporations therefore set for themselves are deeply at odds with the need to create a post-growth alternative. The sixth and final message, which I will not detail, is that these reports are prepared with broad consultations with governments, international agencies, various stakeholders, including NGOs and unions. And I identify in the report essentially two major obstacles to moving to a post-growth future. The first one is the high levels of public debt that cannot be reimbursed by countries unless they continue to grow their economy. We have today 3.3 billion people living in countries which dedicate more money to servicing the debt than they invest in education or healthcare. And so it's a major problem. I think moving to a post-growth future will only be possible if we also address this question of debt forgiveness and restructuring. And the second major challenge linked to the first is that poor countries still must create wealth, yet they depend for their development process on their access to the high-value OECD markets because of a very export-led type of development in which they are trapped. Again, I cannot detail this, but I think these interdependencies between South and North are important, cannot be neglected in our discussion on a post-growth future that should not be limited only to what is relevant to the situation in rich OECD countries. And that is the context in which I propose we discuss the contribution of democratizing work to combating poverty in a post-growth context. Thank you, and I will stop sharing my screen. We look forward to the reactions of Nicolas Bueno, Chidi King, and Yolanda Fredillo.
Thank you so much, Olivier, for such an insightful report. And I really want to salute your leadership here to bring this conversation at the global level. I am so much looking forward, indeed, to hear now from Nicolas Bueno, who's a professor of international and European law at Unidistance Suisse and a researcher at the Center for Human Rights Studies at the University of Zurich. He wrote extensively on work and labor-related issues, in particular his last Labor Law Utopias, Post-Growth and Post-Productive Work Approaches, which was just released with Oxford University Press. We are going to hear from Nicolas for 7 minutes, as from our 2 other panelists, and then we will have half an hour to extend the discussion to the audience, so that you have a chance also to raise your comments or questions, and so we can really enter into a more interactive part in the third part of the webinar. Thank you, Nicolas. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation. And I would like also to thank Professor De Schutter. It's really important that we have this kind of report on beyond growth at the UN level or at the international level. And I'm just going to go a bit more into detail or to precise in which direction we could go regarding work. I will just show a few slides. I had prepared for 10 minutes, but I will do it in 7.
Oh, sorry. No, please speak to, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just off a
No worries.
seminar.
No
So
worries. That's okay.
you
I'm
are the
going to be
terms.
short.
Okay.
No, thank you. Thank you, Isabel, as well for the invitation. So I'm working on researching mainly on how to implement ideas of economic growth, post-economic growth, beyond growth, degrowth in the law, and in particular in labor law, as for the conference today. And with my colleagues Beryl Terra and Nuna Zekic, we just published by Oxford University Press this year, Labor Law Utopia, Post-Growth and Post-Productive Work Approaches. This is an open access book that really look into, okay, we have 13 chapters, all engaging with alternative economic models and how we could reform labor laws to go toward more a beyond growth idea. And what I would like to do in these 10 minutes that I have left now is just to discuss first the narrative. Why is labor law, our labor policies, so much into growth or so much addicted to economic growth, and then criticize this narrative and then build new narrative. And I will show you a little bit how it could look like finally into the law. These are just a few ideas. The problem that we have, and I think Olivier already mentioned it quite clearly, we have a very simple and effective narrative that can be supported by workers, is saying that growth or economic growth is good for workers. This is the one where you know. And this is from at least from the middle of the 20th century, also Keynesian approaches that we need to consume more, to produce more. So if we have more production, we will have more work and jobs. If we have more work and jobs, we will have more income. If we have more income, we will have more possibilities and funding for welfare. I will question that, of course. And then people will have more possibilities for consumption. If they consume more, then they can produce more, and so on and so on. This is a narrative that we have, and this is very that has influenced workers and most people on the planet for the last, at least, if not 2 centuries, the last 70 years. Now, if we go a little bit more realistically on this, and I think it is very important, and this is also what Olivier does in his report, is to challenge this narrative a bit more carefully and the new narrative, or the most realistic growth narrative for workers, looks more like this, that growth is not necessarily benefiting workers, and particularly not low-income workers, and it is necessarily impacting the environment. So that would be a more realistic growth narrative that we can start from, then to design a new one to see if we can find something a bit that is more useful and benefiting more people than the current economic growth model that we have. First question mark, if we have more production, we do not necessarily have more work. If labor or products are made increasingly by more technology, labor technology, artificial intelligence, I don't know, self-checkout, booking yourself. So this is more products that we create, but with less work. So this is already a question mark. The second question mark, this is the one that is usually addressed already from Karl Marx and others, many others, but also in labor law in general, saying that if we have more work, we don't have necessarily more income. This really depends on the bargaining power of workers to ask for more income if they work more. And in some situation, you don't have much bargaining power. If you're in the platform economy, the bargaining power is less. If you're a supply chain workers, if you're in a low-income country that have to accept the conditions of a multinational companies for the production of jeans or in the garment industry, well, more work does not necessarily mean more income if this is not fairly redistributed. And then we know more income means only more welfare if we have a redistribution system in place that is ensuring that more income for the people will also translate into more education, more health systems, and so on. But where we don't have a question mark is that more consumption is also impacting our natural resources, right? So this is the more realistic growth narrative that we can present. And this is important for workers and also low-income workers, that they are not the one who benefits the most from the economic growth narrative. And this is a good starting point for achieving maybe more people thinking a bit differently and towards new narratives. So what could be those new narratives? Here I'm just showing a few narrative that I call well-beism in an evolution, historical evolution in the political economy. We maybe had socialism, neoliberalism, and what I describe as well-beism is all the economic theory looking into promoting human and ecological well-being. And all of these books, maybe you probably know most of them or some of them, all discuss how we can become more efficient in terms of human well-being and ecological well-being within planetary boundaries. And all of them start from the critics that increasingly only GDP might not be the solution, or is not the most straightaway path towards increasing or being really efficient in terms of human and ecological well-being. So I would just like to say, what is human well-being? What is ecological well-being? In all these books, what they are doing better, I think that already the discussion we had in the 70s is looking into what should we grow, or if not the economy, where do we want to be better? And human well-being, usually the indicators of human well-being are either the traditional one, reducing inequality and combating poverty. The other is also making sure that we're very efficient in providing housing, in providing food, in providing health, in being very efficient in an economy to being in a good health. That is, of course, important in a society. And I would add as well, how can we have an economy that makes sure that people have increasingly more and more possibilities to access to free time?
Nicolas, your last 5 minutes.
That's good. Then I will come to the law, because what I wanted to say is that in all these discussions, we don't have so much about work, how work will look like into this post-economic growth, beyond growth, well-being strategy. And I have here two examples. The book that you've written, Isabelle, edited as well with Julie Batilana and Dominique Meda, and post-growth work, are maybe the one who are the two most specific on what is work looking like in those well-being or well-being economy future. And I've identified, because I think for policymakers, it is very important to be very clear and very say in which direction do we want to go. And I think we should go in two directions, or all these books goes in two directions regarding work. The first is we need to rethink the value of work beyond its market value. And the second is about reducing the quantity of work, or increasing our freedom from work, or reducing our dependency on work. Rethinking the value of work beyond its market value, why it is important. I think we all know that some types of jobs are, could be more efficient in terms of ecology or in terms of human well-being, and that should be recognized as such, because it is important for people and for the planet. So improve the social and ecological efficiency of work. That would be a way to rethink the value of work beyond its market value. And what I also find very interesting, I'm also coming from business and human rights perspective, is really how to deter social and ecological damaging work. I think we don't have so much discussion currently on how housing price speculation, food speculation, advertisement, or commercial marketing are kinds of productive activities that are very from a market perspective, very valuable. From a well-being and ecological perspective are very damaging. So how can we make sure that we revalue these kinds of activities, productive activities, within a new concept of value in the well-being? And the second approach is really how to reduce the quantity of work, as Olivier already mentioned, how to reduce the quantity of work. It requires to be less dependent on productive work to produce welfare within a society, and all the direction goes stop taxing workers and tax something else if you want to fund a welfare state. That's for me is quite clear. The second aspect that has been much less, and I will let it here because we don't need to go into the legal aspect. Maybe I will just show you one example or two how you can translate it into law. And would be not to forget about the negative impact of some activities. Take the case of housing price speculation on the price of living costs, on living costs, right? If we do not check how the living costs increase, well, we increase the pressure on people in society to work for things maybe that is that damaging as well, or only to have a job. So I think when we consider how to become more independent from the need to work in a society, we really need to address all the productive, lucrative activities that may increase the living costs in society. And I think this is quite fundamental. So here is the book again that tries to translate well-being into liberal law. And I'll go into three, I don't go into detail, but now we only have like a very minimum approach, a right to a living wage, for example. And the idea would be to go more into a right to just income or a right to a fair income that will include some values into work. If we have the right to work, how could we go maybe more into employment policy that include meaningfulness into this right to work policy? And the final right, and I'm stopping here, the right to rest, only putting like maximum hours and 2 holidays with pay. How can we introduce in our labor legislation the right to work less and having a purpose to work less? So that would be the idea of how to translate well-being into liberal law. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. That was extremely useful for us to continue the discussion. And so now we're going to hear from the perspective of Chidi King, who's the chief of the Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion branch of the International Labour Organization. Thank you, Chidi. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Isabel.
Yeah.
I hope you can hear me well. And thank you for the invitation to be here today and take part in this extremely timely, actually, discussion that we're having. Also, of course, want to thank Olivier de Schutter, Special Rapporteur, for his report, which was, again, an important and timely contribution both to the Beyond GDP discussions writ large, but of course to also the UN Summit for the Future and the adoption of the Pact for the Future. I think it's said very, how shall I put it, strongly in the report and previous speakers that we need to move past the paradigm of growth and trickle-down economics in which we appear to be stuck. With all the evidence showing us that wealth and power has become hyper-concentrated in the hands of a very few, something which is also masked by GDP, or when GDP is the sole or primary indicator of progress or economic success. And has been mentioned, and that we see again from the report, inequalities between and within countries has become, in fact, a major source of geopolitical tension and conflicts, as well as erosion of social cohesion. We've seen that progress in reducing poverty and informality has slowed down. The relationship between these indicators of informality and poverty and GDP, if it was ever there, has certainly become all the weaker. To give you some examples of this, between 2019 and today, labour income share fell by 0.6 percentage points. We are very much in a situation where earnings are not keeping up with productivity, including the productivity which has been much trumpeted in terms of technological developments and advancements. And at the same time, we've seen the number of workers in informal employment, so without access to labor or social protections, growing from 1.7 million in 2005 to 2 billion today. Of course, this is bad news for both women and men workers, but I just want to highlight, of course, that it is worse news for women because of increasing and embedded inequalities, especially for women from poor or socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, as we sometimes say, and amongst whom we do see, of course, an overrepresentation of Black women and women of color, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, migrant women, and women living with or affected by chronic health conditions, such as HIV. And this will bring me, into the meat, I think, of my contribution here today. But before that, I just also wanted to talk about the differences, the gender differences, which is also touched on or highlighted in Olivier's report. So we see again today that there's a global employment gap of 23.6 percentage points, roughly between women and men, and that even where women are employed, they continue to receive considerably lower labor income than men. For example, in high income countries, we see women in employment. For women in employment, there's a missing 27 cents, let's say, for every dollar, compared to employed men. And in low income countries, we see that missing amount rising to 56 cents to the dollar. And our evidence, again, looking at it from the ILO perspective, suggests that this gap mainly stems from family or care responsibilities, meaning that women's disproportionate share of unpaid care and domestic work plays a major role in shaping gender employment gaps globally. And our most recent estimates, in fact, for 2023, showed that an alarming 748 million people who want to work are outside the workforce due to care responsibilities, be they childcare or long-term care responsibilities, along with all that means for their present and future chances, for their health and well-being, and in terms of intergenerational poverty and exclusion. And just as alarming a figure is that of that 748 million, 708 million were women. And this disproportionate amount of unpaid care and domestic work performed by women persists even in the absence of children within a household. So it's a very marked gendered divide. And I think this also plays into all the issues that are covered in the report, but that have been touched on in this discussion today about where the control lies in terms of our economies, where the paradigm lies in terms of our economies, and how what is not what doesn't have a market value is not seen as contributing to our economies and societies. And even in the tragedy, in a sense, is that it's not only unpaid care work, which is so vital and essential, as our discussion at the International Labour Conference, noted this June. Absolutely vital if we're going to have a sustainable planet, if we're going to have a society that is more equal instead of the growing inequalities that we see. Again, if we're going to address poverty, we cannot ignore the question of care, and in particular, unpaid care and women's unpaid care labor. But even when care is paid, remunerated, you see parallels with the way that we value care work generally. I mean, it is absolutely essential to our societies, our economies, but the value that we place on care work is so little, and ensuring, therefore, that as we are having the discussions of moving beyond GDP, we recognize that one of the big failures of this GDP model, this quest for growth model, has been that it has made invisible that on which we most depend, for not only to survive, of course, for our survival, but also to thrive, and indeed to make sure that our planet continues to be able to sustain, our lives.
So your 5 last minutes, okay?
Thank you. Well, maybe I will quickly, in the last 5 minutes, skip through some of the work that the ILO is doing, which I hope will contribute, to the work that is being done in this area generally. The report mentions the absolute need, and I agree with this, to make sure that we are recognizing, redistributing care. On this, I would add that from the ILO's perspective, we also need to reward those who are providing paid care work as well. And reward means not only in terms of their wage packet, but even in a broader sense as well, and ensure that they have the right to representation. And this is a critical thing if we're talking about workplace democracy, because what we have seen going in tandem with this exponential rise or trend towards the concentration of wealth, and the absolute focus almost on economic growth is an erosion of and a deliberate and serious erosion of rights to freedom of association and to organize and to bargain collectively for workers. In other words, for workers to have any type of say, real say in their workplace. And that's the essence of workplace democracy. And set, indeed, or have a say in setting the terms and conditions under which they work. The ILO's constitution says very clearly labor is not a commodity, but we have seen as a result of this erosion the increasing commodification of labor, and nowhere is this more true perhaps than in the care economy. Vital, part of our economies, our societies, something that should be a commons as reflected in the report, but which is again increasingly put in the realm of markets. So the privatization of care, meaning that people's ability to access what is essential and what is much needed is going to be more and more difficult to exercise or to enjoy in terms of human rights. I'm not sure exactly whether I have 2 or 3 minutes left, but I will. Maybe I can sum up. So much more to say that 2 things is we need to be able to see what is being done when we talk about unpaid care work. So being able to measure this through statistics is important, and this is part of the work that the ILO does. We are developing not only statistical definitions of care work, because very often there is a lack of understanding about how broad and heterogeneous this work is. But also we are, of course, making sure that we are true to the international labor standards that this organization has adapted, in particular those around the fundamental principles and rights at work, and again in the care sector the important focus of workers in that sector being able to access those rights. But I'd also say, and glad to say, that there is really a strong convergence or coherence, if you like, between the human rights economy, which is introduced also in the report, which seeks to redress root causes, structural barriers to inequality, justice, sustainability, prioritizing investment in economic, social, cultural, civil, and political, I would add, rights. And the ILO's pursuit of social justice in line with its mandate. Final word on care, absolutely critical to see this as an investment in all of our futures. It's still too often seen as a cost, and therefore not something that should be the backbone of a foundation of our economies and societies, but something that we actually only can spend on, if you like, when we are in a stable economic situation. We know all the effects of austerity measures and what they have had across the years. So let me stop there, and again just say thank you for inviting me to this discussion, and it's been really a pleasure to read this report from the Special Rapporteur.
Thank you so much, Chidi King, for your engagement with the report. And now let's hear from Yolanda Fresnillo, who has joined the European Network on Debt and Development, EuroDAD, as a coordinator for its debt justice work. So thank you so much, Yolanda. The floor is yours for 12 minutes also.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the very insightful debate so far and the interventions, and for inviting me. And I'm going to bring in obviously the debt element into that, the kind of the fiscal element, but particularly what has all of this discussion to do with sovereign debt in particular. And I'm going to point at that 4 elements. The first one is this idea of overcoming the growth obsession, and this is key when we talk about debt. I call it the obsession of growth. Obviously drives how the economy and the different sectors are prioritized in different countries. This is particularly relevant in global South countries, but it is especially relevant in those countries in high debt, with high public debt levels. This is because the way that the international institutions, particularly the IMF, the World Bank, but the mainstream economist sphere puts on the table this idea that you can only overcome debt problems by growing out of debt. This expression of growing out of debt is very much used literally by these institutions and mainstream economists, with the idea that if you manage to create a growth path in your country, you will be able to then get better revenues and therefore be able to pay out your debts. But we see this as a fallacy. It is not happening. There are many global South countries that have been following very important years of economic growth measured on GDP, and the result of that has been even bigger or higher debts. The other issue is that in order to address the debt payments or the priority of debt payments, countries and governments are pushed into certain sectors that facilitates that they get foreign currency, mainly dollars, to be able to pay out the debt that is nominated in dollars. This is very relevant to what Olivier de Schutter was saying before, of how countries are pushed into making their countries investment, like foreign investment friendly, and how that brings down workers' rights. And the debt element, the debt issue is often being used to push those investment friendly legislation and contexts. So as I say, the theory is countries can get more resources in foreign currency and therefore be able to pay off their debts. The truth is that in too many occasions, these investment-friendly scenarios, these investment-friendly policies and legislations, what are doing are lowering the tax burden into foreign companies with tax holidays for certain foreign investors, and therefore those investments are not reflected in an increased level of revenue, and therefore not supporting the possibility of paying out the debt. The second element I wanted to focus on, I already mentioned it, is how that frames the economy. Not only this this focus on growth, but also what are the sectors that the countries are trapped on. Olivier de Schutter report on Going Beyond Growth mentions this situation in countries are trapped in a post-colonial economic paradigm. And that has a lot to do with that. So countries, particularly in the global south, are focused or trapped in export-focused sectors. In many cases, fossil fuel sectors, minerals, other natural resources extraction, that without added value can help them, as I was saying before, get more dollars to be able to pay the foreign currency denominated debt. And there is a need to break this debt trap, and I'm going to quote here the report, to make sure that heavily indebted countries are not forced to produce for global markets. And here it says, I add also financial markets, and can instead prioritize the needs of local communities. That is what is in the report. And I think this is a key element. Unless we break this chain with external debt, with foreign debt, it's very difficult that countries can follow the decarbonization path and a path to democratize work and a path to dignify work, because that is a huge burden into that. The third element I wanna, and I'll be fast, Isabel. I see you.
You still have 5 minutes, but
Okay,
yes, it's your
you.
last 5 minutes.
So the third element is the element of austerity. And I think I'm not bringing anything new here when saying that highly indebted countries in the global south, but also in the global north. I'm from Spain, and we have suffered this directly. The way the international financial institutions and the mainstream economists put on the table that we need to face high levels of debt is through fiscal consolidation, aka austerity measures. We were in Washington a month ago at the IMF and World Bank annual meetings, and it was quite, I would say surprising, but really there's no surprise there, but kind of surprising on how blunt they were. And here I'm talking, for instance, about the IMF managing director in saying, oh, we are facing a situation of high or higher levels of debt with low growth. Therefore, countries need to, and she used the expression buckle up, need to apply deeper and faster fiscal adjustment. The papers that they produced, the IMF produced during that week, talk specifically about tackling the high public wage bills, so therefore public workers' salaries and numbers of public workers. We have to remember here that public work or work at in formal work in the public sector, in many countries, it is one of the few options that women have for non-precarious and non-informal work, but that women are concentrated in the lowest scales in terms of salary in public work, and therefore, if you apply austerity measures focusing on the public wage bills, you're affecting directly women's works and women's salaries, enhancing that wage gap or widening that wage gap that Chidi King was mentioning. It also has to do with what Nicolas was saying about the need for the public to provide certain services, to ensure certain services. Obviously, in a scenario of austerity, that is not possible. And what we have seen and documented in too many countries now is that in these scenarios of austerity, public services are also being cut, even if that is not explicitly put on the table by these international institutions. And therefore, unpaid and underpaid informal domestic work increases. So it doesn't only reduce that disparity in unpaid work, care and domestic work, but it widens it because the services that are not provided by the public services, by the health services and the education services, are being taken on mostly by women. So we cannot advance in the democratizing the work agenda without tackling this issue and this push and this new push, because there is a new push now for austerity. And also, I agree here with Chidi without putting the issue of unpaid and I say also underpaid care and domestic work in the center. And I'm going to finish with something. It's a very small reference to something that I think is also important, which is the issue of personal and household debts, because in this scenario of widening austerity, where public services are less provided by the public, in many cases, families and particularly women are being driven into personal debts in order to be able to afford basic rights like housing, like school, like health. And this keeps workers, and particularly women, trapped into precarious jobs. And they cannot get out of those precarious jobs because they also have to pay out these personal debts. And I think that link between the sovereign debt and the personal debt illustrates very well how it is, how difficult it is to advance this very important democratization and decarbonization work agenda without putting the fiscal element and particularly that element on the table. I'll finish with this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. So thank you very much to the three of you, Yolanda, Chidi, and Nicola, for having provided such thoughtful comments. And thank you, Olivier, again for introducing the report. So now I suggest we still have 20 minutes to share. The point of this webinar is also to open up a space for deliberation. So because there are major constraints on deliberation online for 20 minutes, still, it would be nice if we could take a first round of comments, questions, suggestions. I would suggest 3 or 4 from the audience, and then we will come back to Olivier and the panelists, if that works for you. Okay? So I think you can unmute yourself and put your camera on. So first, would you mind to raise your hand? And so we can identify you and see people coming in to share thoughts or questions. Okay, this is a very intellectual audience thinking deeply about what has been said. I don't, yeah, Olivier?
No, if you want, Isabel, I can say just a few words about why democratizing work is important beyond the obvious, which is that a more democratically organized corporation will focus on something else than increasing shareholder value. And I'd like to say 3 things, 3 sentences. First, one major reason why corporations are insufficiently attentive to the impacts they have on the community, on the mental health of workers and so forth, is because of what Günther Anders called schizotopia. The decision makers are removed from the place where decisions have an impact, right? The Günther Anders had in mind the pilot launching bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I think the more decision making is removed from where the impacts are felt, the least the decision will take into account the full range of impacts that matter. And I think one major reason for democratizing the corporation is to ensure that the decisions will be more attentive to the impacts on the local communities which workers belong to. That's number one. Number two, what I would like to call the Organocene, just like we have the Anthropocene to describe the new geological age in which human activity influences geological timelines. The Organocene describes the fact that increasingly individuals don't decide, organizations decide. And organizations, big bureaucracies, big corporations have a logic of their own that is focused on completely absurd objectives, such as, maximizing value at all costs, or controlling markets to increasing market share, whatever it takes, etc. And I think we need to compensate or rebalance the logic, the bureaucratic and organizational logic of corporations by bringing this other element in. And I think part of the difficulty we have in moving towards a post-growth future and to address the environmental crisis is because more and more decisions in society are not made by individuals. They're made by individuals trapped into organizations whose logic they are unable to control. It's Frankenstein. And the third remark I'd like to make here is that we often speak about the macroeconomic obstacles to post-growth futures. We need to create growth to pay back the debt. We need to create growth to finance public services and so on. But there are also microeconomic reasons why we are trapped in growth. And the microeconomic reasons are exactly what Yolanda described, the private household debts and the need for corporations to reward shareholders by growing markets, by growing the market share, and by promising them a return on their investment that is year after year, requiring from corporations that they become more competitive, that they control larger markets and have a larger range of consumers whom they serve. And that microeconomic lock-in to moving towards a post-growth future seems to me equally important to emphasize. This is just to connect better what we said about post-growth to the global, to general objective of these workshops.
Thank you so much, Olivier. Yes, that's very relevant, and I am sure many points are totally validated by people in the audience, and so this is really an impressive connection. I think I wanted to really make that clear between democratizing work and future for this planet that is indeed that fits within the planetary boundaries. And for that, to engage with the post-growth debate is something that in our network we've not done so much, and that is going to be a very helpful webinar, I think, moving forward. Now we have three participants whom I suggest to just leave to raise a comment or a question. Thank you so much. So we'll take you in the order. It's Linda, Klaas, and Joao. And please unmute yourself and share your comment or question. And Linda has just disappeared. Is that correct? I don't see her anymore. It looks like
she disappeared.
Yeah, the connection, probably she lost the connection. Anyway, so she probably will log back. So let's hear from Klaas then.
Well, that's unfortunate. The only female voice who showed up. Never. Well, my question. I was a student of German Jena-based sociologist Hartmut Rosa, who described similar patterns that you all described in your analysis as like the dynamic stabilization of the of our society, that everything is to be ever faster to even remain as stable as it is. And I wanted to ask you specifically about the prospects of basic income schemes and how they can maybe what is the potential of them to stabilize the community, to slow down everybody's lives, and to keep stabilizing the economy and the society apart from the dynamic stabilization and growth.
Thank you. Thank you. I see Linda coming back. So I suggest, Linda, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I was out of battery, died immediately. Thank you. Thank you for this. My question is for Oliver the Shooter. Thank you for your work, first of all. To me, these questions of economic democracy is very interesting when I try to think how to apply economic democracy to the different kind of corporations, where I have a hard time elaborating a model that could substitute current for-profit and kind of corporate capture thing is the extractive industry, or those key industries where, let's say, traditionally you would think that the state has a golden share. Because now in my mind, when I see all this let's say profit-oriented running of oil companies and extractive industry, I would think let's nationalize these companies. But then you realize that, for example, French states and Total, they're basically one thing. You realize that the state is basically representing the companies and not the people, really, especially when they have to do damages abroad outside their, let's say, boundaries. So how would that play out again in extractive industry, military, like those strategic so-called industry, more workers' representations in the mix of state, private, workers owned? I don't know if it makes sense. Thank you.
I thank you, Linda. I think we absolutely, you made sense. Thank you so much for that question, that input. Joao? You are muted, I think. I don't hear you. No, it looks like you're unmuted, but would you speak?
If he has a technical problem, there's also a question in the chat
Okay.
we can take in the meanwhile.
Okay, no worries. Yes, and you can input it in the chat too. We have another question. I suggest we take another question in the chat and then we go back to the panelists. But so Ana Oliveira asked the following question. We are seeing democracies move towards neoliberalism lately and become more individualistic. How to convince people that stronger laws to limit profit and encourage well-being, for example, are important? So a question about the nature of power. That's a tricky one. And then, Joao, we don't see your question yet. Yeah, is moving out. Probably will no, Joao.
Now you can. Now you can hear me.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I was able to switch the microphone. Thank you all for your presentations here. It's the first time that I attend one of these seminars. Some of you talk about the new ways to fund the welfare policies and to renew the sources of funding. And I want you to, if you want to comment about the possibility to use property tax to fund some of these policies. For example, on houses that do not fulfill a sort of use value, but are used as an asset. And because this is an asset that you cannot move from one place to another, it doesn't have the same properties as a financial asset, which is harder to track. property is not something that you can move. And if you could comment on the possibilities to explore this possibility and the advantages and disadvantages it may have, I would pretty much like to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I suggest, because we are trying to finish on time, always, just to make the organization of the webinar feel reliable. So we are going to close at 30. So now I suggest we just go for one round through the panelists, starting with Olivier or finishing with Olivier, maybe starting with Olivier. And then we'll hear from the three other speakers. And so 2 minutes each maximum would be perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. 2 minutes at most, 4 remarks. First, in answer to Klaas Goldenstein, I'm a big fan of Hartmut Rosa. We actually have a dialogue, and I'm absolutely convinced that one of the obstacles to a post-growth future is that we are trained to treat people and what surrounds us as resources for our selfish use. And I think the idea of resonance, which Hartmut Rosa brought to the discussion on why society is failing, is extremely important, because it would be, if you wish, a substitute to the materialistic obsessions we have that have taken the place of religious faith. So I think it's really promising. One difficulty I have, and that is what I discussed with Hartmut Rosa, is how to translate the intuitions about resonance into public policies that could support that. What would it mean to have a state enabling resonance-based relationships, right? And which are the indicators that could be used? And I think he says in his latest work that there is no political philosophy of resonance yet, and I think we must build that. Secondly, to Ana Oliveira, you are quite right in the diagnosis, I think, about neoliberalism emphasis on individualistic solutions. Social capital, in the way it's used by Robert Putnam, not in the way it's used by Pierre Bourdieu, but social capital, the cement of society that brings us together and gives us a sense of belonging, is absolutely vital to preserve and to grow. One reason why blue-collar workers in the US are, using drugs, as documented by Angus Deaton and Case, is because social capital is really eroded so much that they feel lonely and abandoned. And I think we need to recreate this. That is also one obsession of Hartmut Rosa's, based on the work of communitarians that he was deeply influenced by. My third response is to João Pereira. No wonder this comes from Brazil, and I applaud the proposals of Brazil to tax the 3,000 billionaires in the world. I think it's important. You will see in the report I did on post-growth that there is an emphasis on the wealth tax as a substitute to taxing income in a post-growth world. And there's inequalities based on wealth are much more important even than income inequalities, so we need to address this. And then my fourth and final comment is there will be a follow-up to this report. We are building now a roadmap between now and the end of 2025 that will be based on what NGOs, think tanks, unions provide, and that will lead us to identify short-term, mid-term, long-term measures in various areas to show that post-growth society is not simply a vision, it's also a roadmap, it's also a pathway we can propose to governments in the post-SDGs world beyond 2030. So many of you will hear more about this, and I hope you can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. So 1 minute each then to Nicolas.
Yes, okay. Well, I pick up one question, the basic income, maybe just that we have one chapter in the book about the basic income as a tool for a post-growth labor law. I see from a well-being economics, most are in favor of a basic income. I think there are very good points like increasing independence regarding to the labor market, maybe having more time for yourself or for activities that can conduct to well-being. I would be a bit more critical regarding the funding. If we continue if we fund a basic income through income tax, then we are going to create another dependency on workers and productive work. It is the funding. And the other, so it's never a black and white answer. We have to be very differentiated. And the other first client that I see leaving a very useful job for a basic income might be also the care worker. So I would always couple a basic income with the care economy and the strong policy in terms of care, for example, to ensure that they continue doing their work on good working conditions.
Thank you, Nicolas. Sorry.
I read it here, yes,
Yeah.
but very interesting things.
From
Thank you for the
Chidi.
remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much. From Chidi, 1 minute.
I will be quick, I hope. Maybe I will go to Annie's question in the chat, unsurprisingly, about the main actors who can drive change towards democratization of work. And I would emphasize again the role of workers and their organizations engaging, having the ability to engage in dialogue with employers and their organization. So this building of institutional strength in both employers and workers' organizations, I would say, is key, but also at the governmental level, very often on the ground. And when we're talking about shaping policies, when it comes to the world of work, when we're looking at line ministries, it's not the labor ministry that's going to have much of a say in the direction in which a given country is going in terms of its economy. And yet labor is central to any country's economy. So again, strengthening those types of institutions, I would say. I'd love to go deeper, but I know we're out of time. So
Thank you so much. Absolutely key. Yolanda.
Very, very shortly, Ana Oliveira put in the chat how to convince people that stronger laws that limit profit would be important in this context. I think one of the things that is necessary is not to go for simple or simplified proposals. Life is complex and people can understand that. And I think connecting the dots like we did here is very important. Collaborate, support campaigns, because and make sure that connecting the dots is done. Provide that information when people are struggling on the streets of Kenya against the tax bill of the government, and explain the debt element and how that impacts work on the ground. I think collaboration between different sectors is key for that, and for bringing in a more comprehensive message, as I say, connecting the dots. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Then I think we should come to a close. Unfortunately, this is only a beginning. I absolutely want to stress what Yolanda said, which is to connect the dots. This is really a big endeavor that we are all engaged with. And so thank you so much for that. Our next meeting will be on January the 30th. We will continue the conversation on yet another important report that was actually commissioned by the government of Canada on discrimination issues in the workplace and in the labor market. This was a report that Adele Blackett drafted. She chaired that commission. Adele is a member of our Democratizing Work core group, and she will be presenting the report, and we will hear from panelists. So please come back. It will be very important for our transversal discussion through the various webinar meeting points. And as we do this, we hope to strengthen our community across the globe. So thank you so much for the Wage Indicator Foundation team to have powered this discussion again. And let me thank in your name, Olivier again, Nicolas, Chidi, and Yolanda, and all of you for your presence today. So keep up with the great work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel.
And we will have the recording online on our webpage on democratizingwork.org. So if any of you want to have other people watching it to think more deeply about the webinar issues, please, you will be able to refer to that recording. See you soon and take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.